This is Art364 Part 14, and we're beginning with the 20th century. And the 20th century is dominated by skyscrapers, and this building is called the Wainwright Building, designed by Louis Sullivan. Was begun just a few years before the turn of the century. And as a skyscraper, it's not very tall. It's only like 10 stories tall, which doesn't mean um, it's not scraping a lot of sky. Given just over here, you can see in the background there's one much taller, and they do get much taller than that later. But at the time this was made, it was the tallest building around. Uh, what made skyscrapers initially? First, there had to be steel. Using steel as a material to make buildings, was a game changer. We saw that how effective that was in the Eiffel Tower in the 1890s. But once they started using steel, it became possible to build things much taller because steel has a much higher tensile strength than stone, which is what things used to be made out of prior to that. And stone is very limited. You can only go so high with it. Well, and its ability to resist the force of gravity is is a lot less than what you can do with steel. Other things you can do with steel that can change the quality or the design of the way buildings can be made, and that's one of the reasons we put this in the on your list, is because there's the significance of steel. Let's look at the inside of the building as a picture from when it was under construction. What makes a building like this necessary? First of all, you have to have business, a business that needs to have a lot of office space. And businesses would congregate into cities with or have a limited amount of space, and that real estate becomes very valuable. If you have a small piece of real estate, you want to make the most of it. So instead of building out, you build up. And you couldn't build up until the advent of steel. But also, one critical feature that had to be invented was the elevator, because nobody wants to walk up, 10 stories to their office on stairs. So the advent of the elevator made this possible as much as the steel did. Or they were both necessary conditions. But you can see what it looks like on the inside. It's a grid of horizontal and vertical beams of steel, I-beams. And they're designed so as to maximize the strength given a minimum amount of steel, similar to what you see in the Eiffel Tower. Except here, there's rows and rows of identical cubic spaces made out of these linear girders, welded or riveted together to make a kind of a honeycomb structure. And the structure, as you see, is throughout the building. It's on the inside of the building in this mesh, cubic sort of mesh. This is in contrast to the way buildings had been made before, where the walls essentially hold up the building. The walls, and you have something to span from one wall to another, either with beams of wood or some sort of vaulting using an arch system. But that's of course limited by the how much span you can do with stone, and it affects how you can make a building. If the walls are what's holding it up, but here it's the inside that's holding it up. This grid of beams are the whole structure. They're holding the building up, so that the stuff that you see on the outside, the walls, are really applied to the surface. It's just it's called a curtain. You can have a curtain of glass, as you saw, buildings. You've probably seen lots of buildings where the whole surface is glass. That's made possible by the fact that the structure of the building is on the inside, and the glass itself is just hanging off of it. And in this case, the stone and everything that's put on the outside gives the impression that it's holding the building up, but actually the building is being held up on the inside. This is just decoration. You can see how it's made. You know, each floor is made and girders are welded together and to make the shape, and then these scaffolds here are put so as to put a you know, the surface treatment on the outside. And the surface treatment can be anything. And if it can be anything, one of the things in the early buildings was to make it look like an old building, like something from the past. In fact, the design of this building goes all the way back to the Renaissance. The way it's articulated is in three parts, similar to this building. I'll come back to it. You can notice there's this part down at the bottom, you know, the base, and then there's the middle part of, you know, identical rows of floors, and then you have a cornice overhanging at the top, similar to the way this is designed. It has a base, you know, the part that looks, it's a little thicker than the other floors. It feels by the articulation of the stone as if it's weighty and massive, and then the part up here is smoother, cleaner, more geometric up here, and then you have this long horizontal here with that overhangs a long way, creating this roof effect. It's this kind of design scheme goes actually all the way back to the column, like this kind of column. It has a base and a shaft and a capital. You know, that's a familiar architectural form that everyone knows, and when you articulate it on a skyscraper, you're doing it for almost like nostalgic or sentimental reasons, you know, but also for the purpose of making it look more acceptable. Like if it were just a screen of stone or a screen of glass, or when this was made, it had to be made in such a way that it would be not too out of place in the regular sort of buildings that had been made up to that point. And so it's much more familiar. Everybody understands bases in the middle part, and then a capital up here, like a column has, or like the familiar palazzo from the Renaissance. You know, this is a familiar type, and if you go into most downtown anywhere, pretty much any town in the world, this sort of articulation of base in the middle part and a top part like this is universal in buildings. And when you make a skyscraper, you know, you might as well use that kind of familiar system so that your building is accepted, and it looks nice. But it is for visual reasons only. It's not necessary as far as making the building hold up. Now, buildings that were made prior to this needed, you know, a strong corner like this. You know, this is thicker here. It gives it the impression of a greater strength, that the building looks like it's strong, even though this part is just hanging. You know, it's not holding anything up. You know, all of these things that look like attenuated columns, you can see it has a little capital there. You know, it goes down to a base here. These look like they're structural members. You know, it makes the building look strong. You don't want to walk by a building and it looks like it's going to fall down. So you have these things that look like structure. Everybody's familiar with how buildings work, and they look at it and you can see, oh yes, this is a building. It looks very strong, but it's essentially an illusion. There's nothing about this stuff that you see on the outside that's holding the building up at all. Louis Sullivan also added things like this to add to that character of the building, to make it feel like it's more familiar. It has decoration. It has these vegetal motifs here, little circular windows, in order to make it more familiar, nostalgic to, you know, a bygone era. Though again, this is just external decoration that has nothing to do with the structure of the building. And later architects will remove this part entirely and not even have decoration at all. And so, as you may be familiar with, you know, skyscrapers in cities, they're often completely devoid of decoration. So early on, when they still had tradition in mind, they used this kind of thing in order to make it more acceptable to the public, I guess. But essentially, the building is a business building. It has offices. People work in it. It's designed, for entirely for functional purposes. The bottom floor is for stores. It has great big glass windows that people on the street can look in the glass and see products and go buy stuff in stores. And then up here, there's offices. And up here would be the mechanical stuff, like air conditioning units and all those sorts of things. The water tanks and things would be up here, mechanical stuff. So it all has a utilitarian purpose, but the decoration on the outside makes it look more elegant and a beautiful thing. Okay, so that's architecture, beginning of the 20th century. Let's look at painting. The first big movement in the early 1900s, like 1904 or 5, around there, was called Fauvism. Fauve, F-A-U-V-E-S, refers to a group of painters, including this one. Matisse was one of the leaders of a movement that derived from the post-impressionists. That is, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Gauguin. Those artists, they had moved painting from what it had been, the realist movement, then the impressionist movement, then the post-impressionists, moving away from strict representations of things, moving away from detail, using broken brushstrokes, flat areas of color. So where do you go from there? It looks as though there's a stepwise fashion of moving every one of these movements, changing from one movement to the next, characterized by doing something that is against tradition. Like, how do you move the ball forward? Essentially, if you're moving in the direction towards abstraction, complete abstraction, and you have traditional painting and it has all these characteristics, well, you just drop them off one by one. You drop off the need for it to be a historical or religious picture. Then and so you have paintings of real things that people are seeing. Then you have, you drop off the need to have polished surfaces where you smooth out the brushstrokes. And so you have painterliness. Then you have artists, like Van Gogh, who are using the movement of paint on the surface for emotionally expressive purposes. Each time you're sort of leaving off some aspect of tradition. Well, one aspect of tradition that is being left off for the Fauves was local color. Local color means that when you color something according to the color that you see, grass is green, the sky is blue. That's local color. So if you change that and not have local color but have arbitrary colors, just whatever the artist wants to put for an area, just put that color. Rather, sort of the way children sometimes draw with colors. They just start picking up colors and drawing, regardless of what the color is supposed to be in terms of local color. So the Fauvists, using the kind of brushstrokes that Van Gogh would use, or Gauguin, or Cézanne, breaking things up so that figure and ground are no longer separate, and then adding to that arbitrary colors. So what we're looking at here is we call the woman with a hat, and this would be the picture that in the middle of the show of the Fauvist that attracted the most attention, because it moves so much farther away from what one expects of art. Normally, the viewers of art, the people, the viewing public, they have a certain expectation when you go into a museum or a show and you see art. You're aware of all the art that you've seen prior to that, and you have an expectation based on the kind traditions and the sort of things that other artists have made. And when they saw this, they were very surprised by the changes, by the how far you've moved away from tradition. All of this wild colors, strident kind of colors, almost like, in your face, um, you know, weird kind of colors, like just this background here, changing from here to here, and with this, scribbly paint, and just changing from one color to another without any uh, without any reason to it, without uh, uh, anything that is like representation. And within the face, having these bands of colors that are just, unexpected and non-local. Um, One of the critics called them like they were wild beasts, and the word is fauve, means wild beast, and so they took that as their name, similar to the way the Impressionists got their name. Looking at it through our eyes, after having, been through the 20th century and all the innovations that have occurred through it, it doesn't look that wild at all. It looks rather attractive and almost like festive looking colors, uh, like it's made to be pretty, but it also has the qualities uh, of traditional painting in that it's a portrait. The pose of the sitter is similar to many other portraits that a person would be familiar with up to the point that this was made, and so it has a kind of a chassis that is it's based upon tradition in terms of the shape of the figure, the pose, the eyes looking out toward you, sitting in a chair sort of away from you but turned with the arm on the chair here. All these things are very traditional. It's the rendering, the loose rendering, the loose brushstroke, which I guess people hadn't even gotten used to from the prior 2 decades with uh, Cezanne and Van Gogh and the Impressionists in general, but also the absence of local color. That was apparently something that makes it wild, or makes it look like something done by a wild beast, is to paint a picture where color just goes from one to another arbitrarily without reference to anything in the world. Here's another Matisse that's on your list. It's called the Joy of Life, and this again is the same sort of thing as a traditional picture. That is, it's big, it's a horizontal, it's a landscape, and the disposition of figures and trees come from an actual classical picture. Here's uh, an engraving by the Carraccis from like before 1600 uh, of a sort of like a bacchanal, a bunch of nude figures out in the woods, and they're dancing in a circle over here, and um, it's called Love in the Golden Age. So he's taken that picture, something from tradition, and seen it through these fauvist eyes, where he's filled it with large areas of arbitrary colors, to look like joy, to look like prettiness, to look like the kind of thing a child would choose. The hugely bright colors, and rendering the figures as if they were like a child, just an outline and very simplified. But the outline, just look at this outline. Just this bright red outline here, and then the green over here. All these things are, they're completely arbitrary. They're not referring to anything other than just the artist chose spontaneously to use that color rather than another. Even Van Gogh, when you look at his choices of colors, when he makes a landscape, I mean, they are, the trees are green, the sky is basically blue, and the grass is basically green, or the wheat is wheat color. I mean, Van Gogh, even though his paintings are removed greatly from the experience of actually looking at those things. Some of they're abstract to a great extent. He still was fixed, as is every other artist in the prior to the 20th century, on local color, making things the color that you see them as. To move away from that is to, it's almost as if you're not having rules at all, until you see the next one. which is Picasso's Young Women of Avignon. His original title was The Brothel of Avignon, and it's 5 female figures in a square format. But here, Picasso, having seen that Fauvis exhibition from just a year or two before, this would be 1907, wanted to outdo that. It's almost as if the competition among 20th century, early 20th century artists is who can move farther from tradition, who can drop off something you thought was a basic aspect of painting and not have that, or move in some different direction that will offend or surprise or whatever the audience's expectations of what painting is. So to make his name, Picasso early in his career painted this. First of all, it has a classical look to it, in the sense that 5 nude figures, female figures. That's something a classical subject would do. Many neoclassical artists, Ang, for example, would have an opportunity, say a bathhouse, where there would be nude female figures as part of a neoclassical academic, perfectly acceptable picture. But Picasso has taken that subject matter and turned it on its head. What he has is what he's taken away from what the expectation of the viewer would have of tradition is beauty. That is, he's making things that are deliberately ugly to shock. And what he's done is he's taken these figures. First of all, the shapes of all the figures have been broken into facets, large facets, so they're no longer, 3-dimensional shapes. They are as if they are flat shapes, and they're broken up into the minimal amount of representation. You can see this as a standing figure, another standing figure, but not even on its legs, almost as if you're looking down on a lying down figure. This figure is seated, but there's, you don't know which leg this is supposed to be. There's only one of them. The arm is connected to the body without any indication of hands or the surface characters of any of these limbs. The facets, like say this facet, it is something that's sort of like shading, a light side and a dark side, but it doesn't seem to correspond to the real world in any way. And the background is also faceted, similar to the figures, in an arbitrary way. I mean, this leg of this standing figure is broken up into facets. It's so removed from a leg that it's not even a leg anymore. But the pose, you can recognize this pose as kind of like an Egyptian statue or a Greek Kouros figure. So there's a reference to history and to the history of art, but without but seeing it through an eye that changes it so radically that it becomes a shocking thing. Look at also the faces. They're wearing masks. I mean, these 2 masks are African masks, and so they're from primitive art, which Picasso had collected primitive art because it became popular to have shows, or like places in Paris where you could buy African masks, or also, and these are kind of masks also come from Iberian art. That is, Picasso is a Spanish painter, and he's painting in France. In his home in Spain, the primitive peoples of that land would have made art that had been recently discovered, and they had this kind of face to them. And so he's putting primitive art into his picture in a picture that is sort of ostensibly like a classical picture, and he's also faceting everything so as to break up all the pieces, so that he's doing something similar to what Cezanne was doing when in that Mount Saint Victoire picture. Though Cezanne he still made an attractive landscape, though what he's doing is taking forms that he sees out in the landscape and changing them into a kind of a facet and like rebuilding them on the canvas. And he did a lot of that. He even did figural paintings, and Picasso saw those. There had been a retrospective of Cezanne's work that he saw, in addition to, work by Van Gogh, who had come to the fore in the early part of the 20th century. And mixing that thing together and looking at another artist who is consciously doing things that are solving visual problems. Like one of the big visual problems you have in history of art is the figure ground problem. How do you solve it? How do you make it so that the figure and the ground work together into one unified space when they are essentially opposites from one another? And what he's doing is chopping the figure up into shapes and chopping the background up into shapes and making them relate to one another in terms of their shapes. Their facetedness is similar throughout. So that makes the figures fit in. And as you look at it, the overall picture, the figures in the ground feel as though they're made of the same material. They're made of the same kind of treatment so that they work together. So he's solving visual problems, but he's doing it in such a way as to shock the viewer, to give the viewer something that they're not expecting. It's something that is deliberately ugly. As one of the critics said, it's as though he is forcing us to eat rope and drink gasoline. But that was just the beginning of the direction he was moving. He and another artist named George Braque together invented something called Cubism. This is an example of it. This is the one on your list, but let's move on to one that's a little more recognizable. There's a woman with a mandolin. The idea of taking the background and breaking it into facets, and taking the figure and breaking it into facets so as to make them similar to one another. And as you see here, the facets are modeled as if they were three-dimensional objects in being lit, but the lighting is not consistent throughout, so as to make them each a separate piece. And whether they're pieces of the figure or pieces of the ground, they're all separate things, but they fit together because they're all treated the same way. They all have the same painterly texture. They all have a bit of light and dark in them, and there's an overall tonality to it. That is, the color is all one unified monochrome kind of color. So he's unifying figure and ground with this sort of thing, and he and Braque made a lot of pictures, and as they made them, and they got further and further away from representation. So here you can see a head, and you can see shoulders, and you can see arms, and you can see the mandolin, even though they're broken and greatly abstracted. But the one we have on our list is called Majoli, where he's taken that to another step where you practically can't see the figure at all. You can kind of generally see that there's more pieces sort of in the middle than there are towards the side. But if you say, well, where's the head? It's probably over here somewhere, but like, where's the nose? Where's the eyes? This is kind of like where the mouth ought to be. Maybe an eye's over here, but I'm not sure because it's not clear enough. And maybe this is an arm. There are things like that looks like fingers here. And if she's holding an instrument, a musical instrument, then there's a treble clef here, and there's letters on the canvas. I mean, when do you ever see that? Putting letters on a canvas since letters are themselves and symbols are graphic things, and graphic things are inherently flat. It is part of the world that he's creating is one where he's dealing with flatness, with the surface of the canvas, and wanting to not disturb that flatness by making anything illusionistically round or three-dimensional, or seeing any kind of solid object against a background of air that you where you have a problem, a visual problem. It's something that's not part of the world of the flat surface of the canvas. Cubism was hugely influential for the 20th century. It and not just this specific kind of cubism called analytical cubism, but just the idea of artists consciously dealing with the visual problems of form, rather than trying to make pictures of things, or having representation or storytelling being the primary thing. It's actually moved so far away that we don't even have representation anymore, or hardly any. He may have had a sitter, and the sitter may have been holding a mandolin or some other musical instrument, but at some point he's moved so far away from that representation that it's no longer recognizable. So that's Picasso. We'll see him again later. But first, let's look at another movement, sort of the futurism movement. This is a French artist named Léger, and this is his take on Cubism. Notice it doesn't have cubes anymore. Cubism is kind of not really a good word, because it's not really about cubes, but it's about breaking up the figure in the ground into pieces. And the pieces that Léger decided to use are things that look like they come from industry, and the futurist movement was about glorifying modernity and industry and machines, and this sort of thing is an example of what he's doing, similar to Picasso, in that he's doing a traditional kind of picture. There's three women, presumably nude women, and there's a still life, and they're in an interior space. But they have been changed so radically, so to be almost unrecognizable. You can tell where there seem to be three of them. There's three faces, and they're not just regular faces. They look like almost cartoonish versions of classical faces. And it's the same face, and all of the pieces of their bodies have been remade into quasi three-dimensional forms, as if they were cylinders or spheres or cones. And the modeling of these things, like the modeling of going from dark to light to create these shapes, aren't consistent with anything like a light source. Like when you normally think of three-dimensional objects in space and you're depicting them, when light hits them, wherever the light hits it directly is going to be light, and it's going to go to dark on the other side, away from the light. And it's what these are doing, except there's not a light source that's consistent with all of them. So it's almost as if he's taking pictures from somewhere else, or taking representations of three-dimensional shapes from somewhere else, and sort of cutting them out and putting them here arbitrarily without reference to a light source, or to the actual shapes that you would be seeing if you were looking at these three women in this interior space. And the way he's doing it is just his particular way of doing it. Picasso had his way, Braque had his way, and any number of other artists who were following this Cubism movement, had their own style. Léger has, likes patterns, so he repeats patterns, sort of dazzling the eye with lots of color and pattern, so as to almost camouflage the figures, so you don't know where they start and stop. Like it's hard to tell. Like, this must be a reclining nude, this figure here, and reclining this way, but it's not clear what these shapes are. Are this part of the legs of this figure? Is this a continuation of those legs? There's a cat over there. This looks like a seated figure. And this one looks like a reclining figure as well, but where the legs are is not clear. So not being clear is because um, they've only taken the image of the figures as a point of departure, and taken forms that those contain, and brought just the bits that the artist wants into the picture, so as to compose those things. So it's so far removed from tradition that these things were initially shocking when they first come out. In Italy, futurism was a big deal. Uh, Italy has a whole lot of baggage from the the history of art, the whole antiquity, the Renaissance, the Baroque, all of that stuff is all part of the Italian tradition, and with modernity and World War One coming on, and just the world changing. Um, you have people responding to that by wanting to sort of move away from that whole tradition that occurred before the 20th century and make something new. And this are people who embrace modernity and speed and technology and cars and airplanes and things. So this is a sort of imagery that came out of the futurists. I'm showing this because we're coming to a sculpture by one of the futurists, but I will show you the examples of paintings that were inspired by a combination of this futurism movement and also Picasso's Cubism, breaking the figure up into lots of pieces and stuff. So these are examples by other artists that are examples of that. And then we come to this by Boccioni. This is called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, and it's a sculpture. It's originally made in plaster, and it wasn't bronzed until after his death. And there are several different ones. There's one in the New Orleans Museum. It represents a figure like a striding, walking man. You can see legs there, and there's these big cubic-looking pedestals, one for each where his feet ought to be. It doesn't have arms, but it has something like a head, almost like it's wearing a pediment, but it seems to be urgently walking forward. And the forms that come off the figure, like these two things here, this area here, it's as if the figure were wearing some sort of fabric that's blowing in the breeze. And so they are breaking up the silhouette of the figure, similar to what happens with Cubism. So this would be an example of a Cubism taken into sculpture, and but from the idea of someone who belonged to this movement of called futurism, which is about speed and movement and technology. So there's something quasi-mechanical, or at least industrial looking, about the way the figure is broken up. Look at it from different angles. This looks kind of like machine parts, but it also looks like organic parts as well, like the kind of aerodynamic forms that you see in planes and cars when they want to move through air really quickly. They're made aerodynamic and streamlined. So there's some streamlining going on, and there's industrial looking stuff going on, but it's all or largely abstract. It only vaguely resembles a figure. Like if you look, all right, where's the face? The face is sort of in this area, and the shoulders over here. It doesn't appear to have any arms. From the back, you can say, okay, I can kind of see back characteristics here. And there's a shoulder here, and there's the back of the leg, the calf. There's things you can recognize as being part of a human figure. But it's also abstracted in some largely moving away from the natural forms in a direction where it's kind of anatomical, like it's like you're looking inside the figure. It's kind of industrial, where there's parts that look mechanical. There's kind of organic in the way machines that have to move through the air are streamlined, and it's broken. The silhouette is broken up into things flying off of it, as if it were um, as if it were a cubist thing. It has a similar kind of look uh, to this. This is the Nike of Samothrace that we saw in Art History 1 from the Greek Hellenistic period. This has a sculpture that has this feeling of movement. It is flying. Um, it looks like it's weightless. It's like it's a Nike figure alighting onto the prow of a ship, and the wind is blowing it. There's bits of stuff where the fabric is moving away from the figure, so you don't see the silhouette properly because of things like this and the wings sticking out. This, is a classical version of wanting to depict a figure in motion. But the Fauvists, or no, I'm sorry, the Futurists, they wanted to move away from all things classical, all things representational, and into this new world of the 20th century where you have machines taking over, and machines are creating the prosperity of this new world of modernism. So in rejecting all of that, they still want to give the notion of motion the way the Nike of Samothrace was. So the motion comes from this leaning in of this angle line, using the forms to make the motion. This angle line going here, the force coming through here, and the adding force. This arc right here, and this thing's. I kind of think of it as if the fabric that a person's wearing is flapping in the breeze. That all these things, all these using forms to make this happen rather than representational things. Okay, so that's it. That introduces you to the beginning of the 20th century, and we'll go a little further next time.